Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the nice presentation and also to show the cover of my book, which I have only for a couple of days, so it's the first time I can share in public the cover of this book I've been working on for maybe 15 years, so I'm very happy. I am delighted to join you tonight to present one part of my work. Actually, I felt particularly flattered.
Sorry, that's the... Excuse me, that's the light.
Okay. That's the light. Sorry. Thank you.
Confused.
Thank you. So I said I felt particularly flattered when I received the invitation, as I realized that I was perceived as one of the scholars actually trying to decenter art history. I had the sensation to be part of a collective move, not to say turn, that until today I was not conscious of. Therefore, I thank Alix Beauvais and the whole team of the Courtauld Institute Research Forum for giving me this precious opportunity to share with you what it does mean to me and how I work with this decentered ambition. I am a traditional 18th century French art scholar with a dissertation dedicated to the painter Girodet. Nevertheless, soon after having completed my dissertation, and especially after getting my first job, I chose to move on and to work in the field of the so-called image of the blacks in Western art, and more specifically in French art of the Ancien Régime and the slavery area. In the beginning, 15 years ago, as I said, it was a traditional iconographical project, but along the way, it turned to become a more ambitious investigation in the making of race as a category of human knowledge, mainly based on arts and images of the Enlightenment. I will not talk about it tonight because I have been lecturing many times on this topic, and even one of the first time, I should say, it was here in this specific room in 2008. I was invited for a seminar. No, it was not in this room, sorry. It was for a conference that it was in this room. It was somewhere else in the building. And it was for a seminar shared with UCL regarding early modern visual culture. And at that time, it was led by Satish Padiyar and my dear friend Meshtil Fent. The book is done yet, as you could see earlier, and will be released by the end of the year. Consequently, it is of much more interest for me to present my new researches and get some feedback about it. The decentering aspect of my work came with the fact, so to say, that I followed the slave ship. After having worked with images made in France, especially in the harbors and cities of the Atlantic Ocean's coasts, I decided to explore further and to shift the investigation's places by looking at where all those black peoples came from. And actually, I'm still midway in the circumnavigation of the Black Atlantic, because I now stop in the archipelago of the West Indies, in the plantation worlds of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, before trying to move on to the western coast of Africa, where most of the enslaved were wrenched of their native countries. For today, I am working with the art, the material, and the visual cultures of the Antilles, and by doing so, more than the geographical shift proper to the triangular traffic, I have to face two peculiarities requiring the decentering of art history as discipline. The first one is that one is physically and geographically dealing with the material produced in the margins of the empires, in the colonies of European courts, and necessarily figuring subaltern subjects of the empire, often even more numerous than the French or the British or the Spanish subjects, even if the last ones were the masters organizing the colonial life. So the places are peripheral, and the characters which I privileged, even if they are not the majority of the population with images, the majority of the figured population in the art are blacks, and therefore, in this colonial world, they are subaltern. Thus, considering traditional art histories, the topic is twice orbital. The second aspect considers the epistemological frame of the École nationale de peinture, or National School of Painting, which, considering the organization of our museums, has not yet been really questioned by our discipline, at least for the galleries exhibiting ancient art or so-called universal collections. When one deals with the art of the West Indies, one has to neutralize on different levels the strengths of this mindset. Because which art could be considered British or French or Spanish Caribbean art when one knows that the wars changed frontiers and national belongings many times in the 18th century before the islands, the Caribbean islands, got politically more stabilized in the 19th century. For example, Agostino Brunias, the most famous Caribbean artist, came from Italy to London and then to Dominica in the early 70s, where he was brought to by his British patron to embrace visually and artistically the New World, and especially new territories of the British. But actually, Dominica was a typical French island, as it was governed by the French from 1625 to 1763, and episodically and alternatively with the British until the end of the 18th century. Where is the center in this case? In the birth nationality of the painter, in the nationality of the founding patron, in the actual crown or the ancient one, but longest crown that has owned the island, and most of all, what kind of authorities we give to the subjects and the models of the painting in the making of their images. Did they take part in the making? And if they are co-authors, did they nationalize the painting and make of it an African one? I will get back to these questions with more positive cases afterwards, but I wanted to point from the beginning on how to leave the shores of Europe require as well to modify the questionnaire and naturalized categories of art history. So we have a decentered art history based first on the consideration of expanded territories of art production in the early modern world, and second on pluriethnic societies in the colonies. But as well, we have another particular effect of this decentering, how to deal with the academic and early modern notion of liberal arts, while those colonial societies were wholly embedded and interlocked in the slavery system, per se contrary to liberty and liberality. What kind of liberal arts could emerge of the social and political system, of this social and political system? Not only arts of enslaved people of African descent, even if it has to be an instrumental question in the West Indies, but as well arts made by the colonist artist as a figure no less stained by the slavery, maybe as much as the enslaved one, regarding the freedom of his mind, if not of his body. And it's something which was also efficient in the time, because we had Abbé Grégoire, I don't know if you know this French writer who has been writing De la cause des nègres, and he has been thinking how slavery did affect, of course, enslaved people, but also affect in his way of thinking, in dealing with progression and enlightenment, the people who did precede the slavery. So it was very efficient at this time that slavery is corrupting in a way the enslaved and the master as well. These are the questions. So what I want to have in mind is how we can talk about liberal arts when we have a slavery society, even if the artist is not the enslaved one. These are the questions that enroll my topic in the need to change my way of making art history. These are the given facts that did decenter on a theoretical level my definition of art history. But by now I would like to address the art objects and the visual culture of the mostly French, with all the quotes required now, the French islands of the West Indies in the slavery era, which means from around 1635 to 1848. I chose a couple of signifying examples, but the corpus is so huge that it would not even be possible to pretend to be representative. I selected the ones which directly engage with the epistemological question of decentering the discipline. In 1842, some years before the second abolition of slavery in 1848, a young French nobleman, Adrien Richard de Beauchamp, who found himself through his recent marriage in charge of plantations in the Antilles, traveled to Guadeloupe and Martinique to understand the functioning of his new colonial acquisitions. Beauchamp was an amateur artist, and he made several watercolors of his journey, like this one, which were given at the end of the 1990s, to Schulcher Museum in Pointe-à-Pitre in Guadeloupe. One of them shows a young black woman with a hoe before an overseer, a commander in French, in front of a sugarcane field with, on the right, natural and undomestic things, palm trees and an exotic bird. This watercolor sums up the aim of this lecture, which is to study the issues at stake in the representation of black peoples and personalities in the French Caribbean island in the age of slavery. Beauchamp has assembled elements typical of colonial life, revealing the lot of slaves and the complexity of relationship between themselves and their masters, but also the communal and social unities that governed the plantation in these islands, devoted to agricultural production. Beauchamp showed as well the omnipresent violence endemic in the colonies of America. The young black woman, dressed in a rough cotton garment, holds the baskets for the seedling, which she has gathered, and a hoe for weeding the canes and digging the soil. She is a field slave given the hardest agricultural work, while the overseer, dressed in a European riding coat, is the watchman and slave controller to whom the white master delegates his powers, including the whip. The overseers were black slaves selected and privileged by their masters and placed in that perverse position late in colonial history. It was not until the second half of the 18th century that the post of undermaster and enforcer was entrusted to a black, instead of, as in the earlier state of the colony, a free white employee. The man and the woman portrayed by Beauchamp are both black, without any subtle difference in skin color, which might give complexity and nuance to the social situation or trump their sexual identity. Their hairstyles and clothes, very different from each other, codify the social differences within slave society. The colored clothes that wind around her head, madras clothes, signify precisely the social meaning of the négresse with a hoe and the overseers, donc la négresse à la hoe et le commandeur, servility and race. The presence of Africans in the Antilles, from their transportation within the triangular transatlantic trade, from the beginning of the 16th century until late in the 19th century, makes a certain visibility in art and contemporary images unsurprising. However, reconciling this black presence with an imaginary Caribbean going from the Antillean archipelago to the American continent and a French empire of variable frontiers is a true challenge. In fact, such complicated equations are not amenable to interpretation, except through fine-grained contextualization of the production and reception of images. To attempt such a task would therefore need to take into account the European national culture of the artists who found themselves on that side of the Atlantic and their confrontation with the African cultures of their models, but also with the extensive racial mixture, essentially pluralistic culture. It is necessary then to foreground cultural and artistic mixture by not only considering images of blacks, but to see black subjects as painted by white artists in order to discern an African subjectivity in the arts formed in a political context made up of separate European and African worlds. These encounters, bred in violence, were also creative, for the Caribbeans today are an outpost of the world, as Edouard Glissant has written. In the 17th century French imaginary, the Antilles is a territory made up of subdivided lands and of multiple entities, divided into tiny parcels according to their European ownership, and of seas crossed by ships and inhabited by grotesques. I think I got a few. Of seas crossed by ships and inhabited by grotesque sea monsters, as you can see in the image, whose presence swung between ornamental fantasy and of real dangers involved in crossing the ocean. There is no trace of a native presence, of a native African presence or otherwise, or even of any other human beings in these ventures. Except of considering that the big ships were driven by Europeans who seized Martinique, Guadeloupe, Dominica, St. Vincent, and also St. Martin for France, even if from the names of most of the islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, Tobago, Jamaica, the major imprint is still that of Spain in the Caribbean Sea of the 17th century. In the eyes of Europeans, the attraction of this new world was above all territorial. The presence of black peoples grew in parallel with the culture of spices, aromatics, and flavoring local products, destined for metropolitan elites. Also, there were representations of plantations which gave elites a sight of slaves at their most servile. The two famous engravings by Leclerc, made a dozen years after Sanson and Tavernier's maps, the precedent map, initiated the colonial agricultural iconography which lasted the length of the 18th century and in which appeared black labor, conditioned and watched over by the white master, controller of the distribution of tasks and productivity, threatening with his stick, standing in the very center of the sugar or the indigo plantations. It reveals how the African slave functions as beast of burden, snatched from his native land to labor for the prosperity of Europe and on American colonial land. The slaves are subjected to the culture of sugar and indigo, like the links of a chain of production, organic and mechanical, simultaneously. This scientific illustration, descriptive and precisely captioned, rests on a systematic inventory of figures and motifs which direct the reading of the image. A dozen numbers correspond with a dozen motifs, describing the machinery and the agricultural activities of the, I quote, Negroes in the case of indigo, and their dwellings in the case of sugar, known as, I quote, Negro houses. That you can see here in the front of this. To show it to you here. Is that it? Thank you. You see here. Negro cases. There is in these images not the individuality of the slave, but a recognition of their labor as necessary for the prosperity of the colonies, naturalizing the presence of Africans in the colonial plantation systems. I think it's a visual method to naturalize the presence of African, not individuals, but slaves in the American plantation system. They form a totality made up of American flora, European machinery and surveillance, and the labor of Africans, whose belonging to the system is indicated by the inclusion of shelters, their homes, that fit in the agricultural space. Contrasted with this is the grandeur of the master's house, always strategically situated by the artist, dominating the slave activity, augmenting the sense of colonial domination and surveillance. The pinnacle is achieved in the abridged version of this motif in Champlain, where you can see here the house of the master. In Champlain's 1720 engraving. It shows a menagerie with the which the black slaves occupy, and the master's house stands facing the viewer in a relentless perspective that looks forward to the architectural and political theories of the Bentham brothers. From the end of the 70s, they had invented a new regime of incarceration based on panopticism that allowed prisoners to be watched without seeing who was watching them. These images of colonial plantation enable us to see them as the first unterrorized experiments of a social organization where architecture and land management gives tangible form to the domination and system of control in exploiting slaves. The image of blacks in the 17th century Caribbean world is then largely dependent on the function of slaves in the colonial enterprise. However, one finds in the work of Charles de Rochefort, I'm lost, in the work of Charles de Rochefort and Philippe de Longvilliers de Poissy, governor of St. Kitts from 1639 to 1660, an engraving that is partly opposed to the panoptic vision of the plantation. The focus is on a single vegetable, in this case a manioc, with which is associated a black slave employed to extract and transform the plant into a product fit for consumption. And you have here the root of the manioc and how the slave is using it to make it something you can eat and consume. It is interesting to note that among the dozen plates illustrating the natural and moral history of the Antilles, only 4 of them associate plants with human beings. The sensitive plant with a white master armed with a stick, the anato with a naked, possibly Carib woman, the mahogany with a naked male with a feather in his hair, evidently Carib, and the manioc with a black slave. The principle is the same in all these images. The scale of the elements is in each case imaginary, but the human-vegetable relationship is identical in all 4 engravings, even though the trees are of different types. It seems that the draftsmen have privileged the description of the plant and made it an attribute that denies the scale of the elements in relation to human beings who emphasize the plant's function and symbolic role in this fecund new land. In the case of the anato and mahogany, their colors conform to contemporary naturalist theories of human diversity, which attribute a red skin to Caribs, which, according to the Jesuit traveler Lafont, was due to native practices of body adornment that became absorbed into their bodies. The root of the manioc, transformed into a kind of bread, was the main staple of the slave diet. In this image, one sees a young man in the process of cutting up a root, which he will transform into starch. The iconography thus rests on a tête-à-tête between the black man and the plant, which nourishes him and others, and which he did not grow for European delectation, as was the case in the Leclerc engraving, showing men and women slaves working on the production of sugar and indigo. This kind of imagery, included in the natural history of colonial lands, feeds equally into a group of works more fitting to artistic production, as in the drawing in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which shows a domestic black in the American islands cutting sugar canes. This drawing unites 2 distinct iconographic traditions of the servile state of Africans in Euro-American households. The turban, the feather, and the livery, costume, I don't know how you do that, of the man recalls the page figures that developed out of the Venetian painting of the 16th century, and which one can see also as black servants from the East in the big banquet paintings of Veronese. These figures appear also in Flemish masterpieces of the 17th century, and then enter the French tradition through painters like Watteau. He drew and painted many versions of the orientalized young black pages, wearing scarves and feathers, and who function as living ornaments in fantastic scenes of Parisian life under the Regence. This black figure, a well-known Rococo motif, is by an anonymous draftsman who sought to join Parisian exoticism with a precise sense of the natural riches of the American colonies, and with contemporary naturalistic iconography, and especially with the forms put in place by the first encounters between the Africans and American nature in the European mercantile project. The Orientalist tendency of this drawing, compared to the Poincy engraving, belongs to two movements, one theoretical, the other more concrete. The process of orientalization of the colonial African appears to me to be a way for the artist and potential viewers to familiarize themselves with these strangers, to make them a little less other, to bring them into accord with an older iconographic tradition and thus more familiar. The Orientalist style acts as a process of visual acclimatization, of strangeness, and of the unknown African American. The more concrete dimension, which results from this theoretical interpretation, suggests that the composition and the project have been devised outside the colonial context, the artist and the patron being unfamiliar with the reality of life on the plantations. The mixed nature of the image, the smile of complicity of the person, the model, the decorative setting create a picturesque travesty that seems to avoid the violence of slavery, which in my view, even an artist supportive of the social order can never totally get away from, even in creating such a light-hearted image. This interpretation of the drawing is perhaps corroborated by the title of the bottom of the sheet. For the author has opted for the role of domestic rather than slave, which in metropolitan France, where slavery was forbidden, recalls the designation of black servants who were, according to the law, employed as domestic servants. The inscription, nègre domestique aux îles de l'Amérique, coupant des cannes à sucre, is a kind of oxymoron. A domestic belongs to the interior and sugar canes to the outside, which reinforces the idea that the author of the drawing misinterpreted colonial reality by confusing it with the Parisian situation. That's why I think this kind of images is properly the ones were not drawn on the spot. This example is at the frontier of the corpus of work that constitutes the subject of this project. This liminarity is evidence of the difficulty, when faced with each part of the corpus, in deciding in what ways it is an Antillean image, and at what point in its conception or its making and its destination it was thought of as the Antille. It was either made by an Antillean or made for an Antillean, or in rare cases, more probably at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th century, all three at once. One of the rare cases where we know is it's another sentence. One of the rare cases where we know all the three characteristics were united is the buttons made for Toussaint Louverture by an unknown local artist after paintings by Agostino Brugnas, an Anglo-Italian painter who lived on Dominica from about 1770 until his death in 1796. The ambiguity of the corpus is due to the ambiguity of colonial art historical sources and of the reliability of the image in general in its relationship to reality. Because how many of the engravings that have come down to us from the 18th century, supposed to inform us of a historical episode in Saint-Domingue or Martinique, were made and published without the draftsman or patron having spent any time in the Caribbean? From this point of view, it is important to guard against the fact that, like the making of archives, the making of art, in Europe at least, is most often the product of views held by colonizers and white slave owners. As a consequence, certain precautions are necessary in the interpretation of the images of the blacks, especially in a project that claims to tell the African experience in the Antilles under slavery. From this angle, Toussaint's famous buttons are particularly interesting because they operate entirely within the Caribbean, from inventor to consumer. They are also local in the sense that they bear witness to the life of a place looked at with an anthropological gaze by an artist from outside colonial Antillean society, the Anglo-Italian painter Brunias. Thereafter, such designs were mediated by numerous European prints that circulated in the paper culture in the whole of Europe. Grasset Saint-Sauveur or Nicolas Pons were artists associated with them, and they were joined by numerous anonymous incarnations, like the little panel illustrating an erotic bathing party in the Museum of Memorial Art in Guadeloupe. Finally, genre scenes of Antille's life, elegantly gathered and interpreted by Brunias, were recovered and adopted by the hero of the first political revolution of emancipation of slaves and blacks in the Americas, Toussaint Louverture. The images conceived by Brunias in the 70s and the 80s in Dominica tell the history of Creoles in all its racial and political complexity. And the appropriation of which they have made the object in their time are indices of their reliability and of their ability to be a witness to the African experience and the collaboration of their subjects in the making of their representation. If Toussaint openly carried the sketches of colonial life on his person, on his body, and on his clothes, he is in a way validating them, for he assumes them to be representations compatible with the way he sees colonial life from the point of view of a black political man and fighter for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of his compatriots in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint authorizes, in the sense of becoming the author, this imagery, whose principal characteristic is to reveal colonial life through the agency of slaves and free people of color, and especially of women. Yes, I should have shown you longer the famous buttons of Toussaint Louverture, let's say. What were the forms of agency that were open to slaves in the colonies? How did they create spaces of invention which could form the foundation of resistance to an order of extreme social restraints and violence to those who resisted it? Works of art like engravings and drawings form a privileged resource to understand this aspect of colonial life. They enable a better understanding of new familial, commercial, and artistic forms that Africans in the Americas, despite being captives and dispossessed in the course of Atlantic traffic, were able to bring about. The visual field is a privileged space in this inquiry into the types of invention and the capacity for action of communities or individuals in the world around them. The visual field is able fundamentally to deal with the implicit and the unspoken. The forms of subversion of the social order appear remarkably accessible through images, for in details and marginal motifs there often dwells a counter-discourse. The black model can impose himself on the author of the image and indirectly guide the pencil of the artist who portrays him. The colonial life offers paradoxical spaces, and the very fact of representing them in painting or drawing, aside from any didactic or moralizing intention, allows one to reveal the forms of circumvention or fake consenting acted by people in subaltern positions. I will give a first example of these paradoxical spaces where the normative social order was challenged by the many and inventive ways slaves resisted to it. The Marché de Saint-Pierre by Le Masurier, painted when he lived in Martinique in the 70s, is particularly interesting. One can see many colonial attributes of the white domination. The colon couples, sophisticated, dressed up, are wandering in the market as figures of the most famous Rococo paintings, and in distant manner with the busy black and colored people deprived of shoes or wearing large shirts. Among the distinction of the whites from the blacks in the repulsive gesture of the men, you can see here. Toward the naked kid who offered an animal-like performance in the traditional motif of the bestial garland with parrots and monkeys. The racial segregation is obvious in Le Marizurier's painting, and only a sexual transaction shows a kind of bringing closer people of different races in the bottom right of the picture. You can see here. At first glance, the market is ruled by the white colonial order, but at the same time, in the center of the painting, and considering the scale even bigger than plausible, here, stands the black family. Looks and gestures are sweet between them. Kids are playing in their mother's skirt. Down on the earth, the mat is full of fruits and vegetables, probably cultivated in their slave's garden. Obviously, the main scene of this painting is the one of a black agricultural and merchant family who attends and leads the market despite the forbidding of marriage between slaves and despite the fact that cultivating, fishing, and dealing were three activities for which enslaved had to struggle. Indeed, they had to spare a little energy after having exhaustingly worked for the master and dedicated it to their own minimal agricultural production during their little time of rest. The black family is central to the painting and in this perspective marginalizes the presence of white column. The market seems to be the place where the rules are in the colored and the black people's hands. The darkest ones, on the contrary of the Brunias imagery, who gives the idea that mixed-race women used to rule the colonial world, do not look like the most dispowered figures. The market, where luxury fabrics are sold by the colored white woman, I see you can see us down here. The market, where luxury fabrics are sold by the colored woman in white, shows an alternative history of the colonial world where various activities, tolerated or illegal, marriage, prostitution, cultivation, exchange, sales, circulations, were practiced by enslaved and free people of color in a capacity fully occupied to trouble the oppressive colonial order. Not that slaves could escape all the numerous constraints and violences imposed to them by the master, but there were strategies of circumvention that are even visible in the artistic archive of the colonial world. And I show a couple of paintings illustrating these activities, just to have an idea of the precisely of the visual archive of this kind of activities. And you have two paintings by Le Masurier, which are kept in the overseas minister in France, in Paris. And you have on the right, Famille d'Esclaves, family of slaves, and you can see the gardens of the slave garden, as we used to call them, and there has been also a possibility to study very precisely all the nature, well, the trees and the vegetation in general that has been cultivated here. And on the left, and they do function as pendant, you have a painting entitled Famille Métisse, Mixed Race Family. But we can think also that it is a free family in a way, so slave family and a free family on the left, and maybe with an albino woman in the center of the painting. In any way, it shows all the kind of skin colors you could find in the painting. So you have here two kinds of families, and you have another two other paintings here. The one of the Peabody Museum, where you see an exchange or something which is probably an exchange, mulâtresse achetant une pomme à une esclave, so mulâtresse buying an apple from a slave, and where one can imagine that there was also circulation of the enslaved or the free people of color, which goes against the imagery we have seen, for example, in the Leclerc engravings, so all circulation are controlled. And here a bass scene on the right from an anonymous painter, but inspired by Agostino Brunias, where you see also kind of layering of black people, mixed race people, and white people on the right. And finally, another kind of resistance to the normative order of the slavery societies. You have the painting of Musée de Montréal, Musée Macquart de Montréal, where one can imagine a kind of either a kind of wife or a kind of concubine, or even the evocation of prostitution through the painting of the femme noire avec l'ananas on the right. So I tried to gather all kinds of activities which were not legally accepted, but were active and that we can document through the artistic archive, I think, or visual archive. And maybe one thing which is interesting, in all the market you only have white people having shoes, except for the woman which is here, who is probably, which is in a transaction, maybe a sexual transaction with the white man here. And you can just see, when you are in front of the real painting, that she is the only one to have shoes. One can see the little space and even minor and relative flexibility grabbed by the enslaved to lead their life, to improve their lives with commerce and kind of luxury commodities, especially in the domain of fabrics. Likewise, especially in a world where almost no recollection, no heritage strategies were possible after the initial ranch and the destitution, slaves were supposed to live in the bodies of Africans were the material from which they could conquest a little more freedom and agency. It was the one and only belonging, the body, actually not fully, hence the masters acted and unbelievably were the real owners of these bodies. Nevertheless, the body of the enslaved was the only tool, the only material, and the only agent altogether of his possible freedom. The only element he could count on to sweeten or escape his captivity by imagination, and eventually to organize his real escape. In a precedent essay entitled Fabric Skin Color, I have already written about how the ornament of the body with fabrics and scarves as extensions of the color of the skin, weaved and cared after by blanchisseuses, laundresses, was one of the places where the Black West Indian artistic know-how and creativity did prominently express. Today, I would like to show how the body and his commitment into the so-called immaterial heritage of music and dance can be considered as another space of creative expression for the slaves and free-colored peoples of the Antilles. The performance of the dance is coming from kind of body art. It is an extension of visual art in which it relies on the mastery of the human movement, confronted to songs and rhythms created by even summary instruments submitted to the dexterity of hands and fingers. Dance as an avatar of visual art, and no doubt performance is one of the expression modalities of visual artists. Dance is then a visual art made of the artful movement of the whole body, plus his adornment and his displacement in the space. Though it shall be considered as a material for the art historian of the 18th century West Indies as well. Dance and music are two creative activities which prove to be artistic production of the bareness of the enslaved. If choreography was not a sort of art exclusive to the enslaved, of course, it was for sure particularly deemed by the slaves because it relies on, I quote, tools and abilities they owned and had kept despite the ranch and the captivity. The decentering deals here with the material or the lack of material specifically identified for painting or sculpture. So in my opinion, dance and music belong to the whole artistic creation in a slavery context that has to be included in the arts focused on by the decentered art history. Or I should say the expanded art history, where the traditional medium is not the unique center anymore. And we have testimonies of the performing arts of the enslaved, the paintings of the francophone Swiss artist Dumoulin, and the essay of Colon Moreau de Saint-Méry, which is the author is a colon, French colon, and author of an history of, I would say, the French West Indies. And I did show you before the 8 little engravings after Brunias that he included in his work. And this same colon, Moreau de Saint-Méry, French colon Moreau de Saint-Méry, who was against the abolition of slavery and against many things in the colonies during the French Revolution, is also the author of an essay who is entitled De la danse, of dance. And it's precisely dedicated to the dance in the colonies he could observe when he used to live there. And it was published in 1801. The status of art as a testimony is obvious in this case, but what is given to the artist as subject to the testimony might come from the models, from the blacks themselves. One can think of a co-authoring of the artist and the models whose dancing performances were so new and spectacular that they attract the interest of colonial artists and authors who represented what they saw as an art expression of the black and colored populations. Therefore, art and images in the colonial times have two goals. First, testifying of the colonial life seen through the lens of the white and European artist. Second, testifying of the creativity of the enslaved in the colonial plantations and Caribbean islands. In this perspective, art was supposed to document art. And these two levels, where artistic productions work as European art and Caribbean art, need to be the questionnaire, the grid, through which the whole colonial production is examined and evaluated. It is not only European art, it is not only an ethnographical document, but both at the same time, and through this we access creativity of the enslaved, and we can think of a liberal art in a slavery society. For the last argument tonight, I would like to come back to the on-the-spot part of the title and pleading the fact that in making those visual and artistic corpuses regarding the representation of the West Indies, one has to be very cautious and the most possible able to distinguish between a production after life, experience in situ, and the fantasies made up in the European metropoles. It is in this distinction that we can think and work with the notion of co-authoring, the models and the artists, with the notion of the African contribution to the making of art in the early modern times, and with the notion, already in these ancient times, of an expanded art made of more numerous medias, ranging from makeup, body art to performance, and finally with the notion of reflexivity in the art making, reflexivity based on the fact that art is actually documenting art. I think that all these arguments are founding a decentered art history for a so-called peripheral artistic production and an ethnically multi-layered and asymmetrical society, the colonial plantation. Thank you.